Also, you still deal with racism and discrimination. So I think about certain times. My dad was a welder, so we always moved where the business was. But I remember certain states that we lived in, when my mom would open her mouth to speak, whether it's at school, kids or even teachers will make comments like, "What is she saying? Where is she from? She talks funny. She talks strange." It's only, Camille, like real talk, within these last couple of years that being from another Caribbean country is exotic and sexy. Before it was like not looked at that way, right? Mm-hmm. And so I grew up in this dichotomy of dealing with racism in both extremes, being Black in America, but also being Black immigrant or Black Caribbean in America. And that was a really interesting dichotomy. So a lot of times when we talk about the race issue, we focus on the fact of African-American experience, being Black in America, but also think about that experience as it pertains to the Caribbean culture. And I think it really came into focus for me when about 2 or 3 years ago, I was working on a project with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. They do a national campaign called National Day of Racial Healing, where they encourage people around Dr. King's birthday to sit down and have those tough conversations about race. And they had hired me on to do the marketing component. I was working with them to do the video component, the video campaign for this event. And I told my American story, my story of dealing with racism. And from a Caribbean perspective, not just from being a Black woman, but being a Black woman who has Caribbean roots. And that story, Camille, resonated with so many people that to the point that when Kellogg put that out, we were just putting it out to show people this is how you tell your story. But it took off in the Caribbean culture. Caribbean communities on Facebook started sharing my video and saying, finally, someone is sharing our story and our experience. And then it opened up an opportunity for me to speak on one of the #1 Caribbean radio stations in New York City about my experience. So that's a whole lesson in visibility is power, right? But it's also a lesson that even in our African-American experience, we have to also remember this diaspora, and it's a continuing dialogue between merging the Caribbean experience with the Black American experience, because the two aren't separated. I mean, when I go back into my Trinidadian history, many of the slaves that came over from the Caribbean, yes, right? Many of the foods that I grew up eating, like saltfish and dumplings and plantains and all that stuff like that. Listen, that was food the slaves planted and harvested, right? It was considered poor food, but I love it, right? So it's understanding that the connection of both of those worlds, and it's so very important to our experience as a whole.